Well, good evening, everybody. As you can see, I'm not Dave Johnson, maybe a slightly older, slightly grayer version of Dave. My name is Aaron Ealing, and I'm just going to spend about the next 40 or 50 minutes sharing my experience that I had at Mount Vernon about a year and a half ago with you. And my hope is that some of you will find something of value that you can take away. I've been to plenty of conferences and plenty of PDs where I didn't feel like they were the best use of my time. And on the flip side, I've been to a lot of them that were great. And I guess my thinking going into these is always, if there's one takeaway, something that I can bring back to the classroom, something that I can use immediately, then it's a good use of my time. So hopefully you find it of value too. I'm very informal. You won't see me in a shirt and a tie. I try to be about as authentic as I can be. So that being said, if you have questions or comments at any time, please feel free to just, unmute your microphone and hop right in. Or if you'd rather drop something in the chat box, I'll try to monitor that at the same time as well. All right, let me get things rolling here real quick. I'm so used to using Google Meet because our district will not allow us to use Zoom. So I'm trying to make sure I know where all the things are in the right spot. So, all right. So it is kind of unusual that this turn went from like a 3-day weekend at Grand Traverse Resort in April to an online conference in February. But it was kind of funny that it just so happens that it ended up being on George Washington's birthday today. So I thought that was kind of funny as well. All right. So here we go. So the title of the session is POTUS 1 and Bringing the Mount Vernon Experience into the 21st Century Classroom. So just give you a little bit of information on me. Currently, I'm a 6th grade science and social studies teacher. I work at White Pines Intermediate School, which is in Grand Haven, Michigan. This is my 17th year of teaching. It was kind of one of those weird feelings this year when I all of a sudden realized I was one of the older people in the staff meetings, and that kind of crept up on me, and I wasn't really sure when that happened, but I'm trying to find a way to embrace it. I've taught grades 4, 5, 6, 7th, and 8th. I started my career in a charter school, actually, the first 8 years, so I have experience at charter and public, both inner city and rural. My bachelor's is in social science and elementary education. I have a master's degree in science education. My email is right there if you ever want to connect with me, if you have more questions or anything. And my connection to Mount Vernon, real briefly, my first connection was I attended a regional workshop that was offered through Grand Rapids Public Schools in summer of 2019. It was part of their staff development, but they had an extra couple of seats available and they were gracious enough to let me join along. And then from there in the fall, I was selected to attend a residential program, which was on Mount Vernon. And the focus of that one was George Washington at War. So most of what I talk about today is going to be my experiences that I had at Mount Vernon, because that was the thing that has really motivated me to kind of share my story and share some of the interesting things I've found out along the way. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this slideshow and I'm going to share the link with you in the chat section here at the end. One of the things that I want to draw your attention to is that just about everything in the slideshow, when you get it, either has notes on the bottom or things are linked to other information. So when you get it, if you're even remotely interested in anything that I had to say today, I would encourage you to go to this slide that says First Step, Get Connected. And this link right here will take you to Mount Vernon's website, particularly to the page where you can sign up for educator email updates. If you do only one thing today, I would recommend doing this. It's a fantastic resource. They share so many resources that it's just unbelievable. And it kind of opens the doors to other things. For me, this whole website is kind of like a rabbit hole. I click on something and I learn something interesting and I want to find more. And all of a sudden I realize I've been on here for like an hour looking up more information about George Washington and founding fathers and things like that. So like I said, if you do one thing, click on this, it will get you connected with just about everything that you need. All right, so right now, their professional development opportunities are a little bit different. So like I mentioned earlier, I started with the regional program, which was in person. I went to a residency program, which obviously was in person. But then this pandemic strikes and everybody's shuffling, trying to figure out how things are gonna work. So there's usually a spring, summer, and a fall residency program. And those have kind of been put on the back burner. And this summer right now, it's being offered digitally. Um, I'm not sure what that's going to look like exactly yet. I'm planning on attending as an alumni just to kind of see how that's going to play out. But I'm really hoping that the world returns to some sense of normalcy in the near future and they can start offering those residential programs again. Because for me, I think the greatest value was being at Mount Vernon and being immersed in the history. And that's really what got me excited about what was happening there. All right, so back to George Washington's birthday. So there's lots of little video clips that are embedded in here. I probably won't play all of them just because I know that we're pressed for time and sometimes the audio doesn't match up with the video. And like I said, everything in here is linked so you can go back in your own time and see, if you're interested in something you want to learn a little bit more. So last week, rather than celebrate President's Day in my classroom, I just turned it into like a President's Week. And we spent each day just looking at random things about George Washington and Martha Washington. It didn't fit anywhere in my curriculum, but I was okay with that because I thought, there was definitely some value in there for the students. So I kind of kicked it off with this idea of, hey, there's a little bit of controversy over when George Washington was actually born, and it has to do with switching calendars. And then there's also that little bit of controversy about President's Day. What is it? Is it to celebrate all presidents? Is it to honor George Washington's birthday? How does Abraham Lincoln tie into there? So what I did is I had the kids watch this video real quick. It's pretty interesting. Like I said, most of these video clips are 2 to 3 minutes long. But after they read it, what I did is I put a lot of these things in Google Classroom. I have 6th graders. We're fortunate enough to have one-to-one technology. So it's very easy for me to kind of slide these things in and turn them into little 15-minute or so assignments. So basically, we watched the video as a class, had some discussion. I put this link in here, which takes you to the Mount Vernon website. Kids learned more about President's Day. And then what I had them do is they had to write a letter to their congressman or their congresswoman and let them know how they felt about Washington's birthday and whether or not it deserved to be its own holiday. That was kind of beneficial because obviously they had no idea who their congressman or congresswoman was. So I put this website on there where you can go in and you can type in your zip code and it tells you. And then it gave the kids a little bit of practice with writing a letter. So I have 6th graders. I feel like I have a lot of expectations for them. And sometimes I have to remind myself that they're, 11 and 12-year-old kids. So one of my students, you found out that our representative was Bill Huizinga. And he says, "Dear Mr. Huizinga, today my classmates and I are studying President's Day and if it should be on Washington's birthday or still the 3rd Monday of February. And my teacher wants me to give you my opinion. I think it should be the 3rd Monday because it can celebrate the birthday of both presidents, Washington and Lincoln," from Dylan. So not very deep, but like I said, these assignments were just meant to be a little quick introduction to the kids, get them thinking and get them writing. So Mount Vernon, when I talked about that website and it being a rabbit hole, there was so much information on there. So when you look at the educational side of it, it's an immersive experience. Being on Mount Vernon is just phenomenal, but they also do a good job of taking everything that's there and trying to make it available to teachers that are sitting at home in front of a computer like most of us are. So what they've done is they've taken this idea and they've divided up into 7 different methodologies. And what these do is they offer different teaching strategies, different resources, typically primary resources, which are very valuable. And they break it down by teaching with place, objects, documents, images, music, food, and biographies. So what I'm going to do is just kind of briefly take you through each one of those, show you some of the things that are there, maybe give you some examples of how I use them in the classroom, get you thinking about maybe how it might fit into your classroom, and we'll see where we go from there. So the first one is teaching with place. This one is an important one because place has a large advantage as a primary source, and it's because it can be combined so easily with other things like document analysis, image and map analysis, landscapes, building. And what it does is it allows kids to make those connections where they can start to come up with conclusions about a specific location and why that location might be so important. So the way I got into this, it was actually spring of 2019. I was still teaching fifth grade at that point. And I taught fifth grade for 8 years, and I absolutely loved social studies at that age group because it covered the American Revolution. And that to me was so interesting as a kid, so interesting as an adult. But I found that the curriculum we were using didn't really have a lot of that excitement in there. So I got on Google and I just started searching for other resources. And I happened to stumble upon this virtual tour at Mount Vernon. So this is kind of what got me drawn into it, because I learned some new things right away. So this works really well in our COVID world because you can actually, virtually get your kids out of the classroom and let them do a little bit of exploring and know that they're going to be safe. So this virtual tour is phenomenal because it encompasses everything that's on the Mount Vernon plantation. And there's a tremendous amount of detail in here. So everything is at 360 degrees. You can very easily get dizzy spinning them too fast, but there's a lot of different access points to what's in here. Okay, if we wanted to go right into the main mansion, into the central passage, okay, it's literally just like standing inside. Now I've been in here and I can tell you that it does look like this in person, with the exception of there's always reconstruction and remodeling going on. Okay, as they learn more about Mount Vernon, they're trying to keep it true to the time when Washington lived there. So this part right here, I want you to take a look at this staircase. I'm not going to tell you anything about it now, but I want you to remember it because we're going to come back to it a little later. It has a very interesting history. But this right here is the main door. I remember standing here looking at this door, and it kind of sends a little bit of a chill up your spine as you're thinking that, okay, this is the original door. You're waiting for a knock on the door. Who's it going to be when you open it? Could it be any of the founding fathers? I mean, the conversations that probably took place in the central passage, it's just kind of, I don't know, it's a good way of connecting you to things in the past, which I think, the further removed we get from the past, the harder it is to make those connections. You can also go down here to this tour interface. And this is what got me the first time, because over here, you can see all the different areas of the plantation and everything that's encompassed in there. So when I was looking at the mansion here, I was scrolling down looking, oh, there's a lot of stuff, outbuildings. I'm like, wait a minute, a distillery. I mean, I know what a distillery is. What is a distillery doing on Mount Vernon? So I clicked on it because I was curious, and it took me to this screen. And I was reading the pop-up, and basically the pop-up is saying that in 1799, which was the year that Washington died, this distillery, which is in Mount Vernon, produced 11,000 gallons of whiskey. It was the largest distillery in America at the time. I had no idea. But that hooked me right away because I was very curious to know more about it. And as you scroll through, there's all sorts of things in here. There's additional information, there's video, how do you distill alcohol, making Washington's whiskey, so probably not appropriate for a sixth grade classroom, but I got to imagine that there's some science in there about how that's done that maybe you could use with some older groups. I don't know. But that was the thing that first connected me in. So, get on there and play around and see what you're interested in. Like I said, it's a rabbit hole to more information. Your kids will have a good time with that too. I literally just gave them the link and let them play around. And I said, hey, find 2 or 3 things that you're interested in, write a post about it, why you thought it was interesting. And almost every kid had something different. All right, it's kind of back on the track, teaching with place. So if you know anything about George Washington, and here's my disclaimer, I'm not an expert on George Washington. I'm just a self-professed history junkie who's happened to pick up some information along the way. So maybe when I grow up, I'd like to be an expert, be one of those guys on the History Channel that knows a whole lot about stuff about George Washington, but that's not me right now. Okay, I'm just sharing what I do know and some of the things I picked up along the way. But many of you probably already know that George Washington was a surveyor. That was his first career. And that required him to go to unpopulated areas of the colonies where he would have to measure out and survey land, describe them, sketch them. And he was very good at it. And that skill served him quite well later on in life, both as a plantation owner, a land investor, and a military leader. So what we have right here, this is a sketch of Mount Vernon early on. I'm not sure of the exact date of it, somewhere in the 1750s or 60s. But one of the things you can notice is it's not just one plantation. It's 5 plantations. Okay, it was significantly larger at one point than it is now. So right down here where this red circle is, that's where the current mansion house and farm is. So as I go through some of these, you'll see that I have those little circles and things just to kind of draw attention to how things have changed over time. As we go through this though, we have to keep in mind that George Washington's family was the minority on that plantation. The majority of the people that lived there were enslaved people, and their experience is probably very different than what the Washingtons was. Okay, so we have to keep that in mind as we look at this. There's different lenses that we have to look through in history, and we have to make sure that we're honoring everybody's experience and everybody's story when we're doing that. All right, so here we have teaching with place still. So I grabbed this shot off of Google Earth about a week ago. So here's the main plantation house right here. And this picture is one I took when I was on Mount Vernon. And it's right in the middle of the woods right here. Okay, so this is one of those things where, everybody's so into Instagram and Facebook and coming up with the perfect picture. This is a pretty nice picture. It was about 60 degrees. It was November in Virginia. The trees were starting to turn. It was beautiful out. Okay. But you're only getting a small piece of what's really happening. If you were to zoom this out on a camera, this is what's actually behind me. Okay. So this picture here, I took off of the Mount Vernon website. Obviously, it's a different season. Obviously, that's not me. But I thought it was very interesting because this picture that I did took, I was standing right here where this person is. Okay. Looking forward, obviously this is spring or summer, everything's green. It still looks beautiful, but there's a lot going on behind me. Okay. This is the slave cemetery. Okay. I'm standing in front of the memorial from the slave cemetery. So you have to pause and think about what that means. Okay. What does the picture really tell us? Another problem that we have is that we don't always see everything that's going on. If we could peel away the layers at the slave cemetery, this is what we would actually see. Okay, so here's the memorial I just showed you. Here's where I was standing. But I want you to look at these blue rectangles here. Okay, these are grave shafts. So from 2014 on, there's been this major archaeological dig going on at Mount Vernon in the slave cemeteries. So they are suspecting that there are hundreds of slaves that were enslaved on Mount Vernon, died, were buried in the slave cemetery, and were kind of lost to time. Well, technology is caught up. Now you have ground penetrating radar that's picking up anomalies in the soil. So what they've found so far is all these graves. Okay, these were actually enslaved people from the plantation that were buried there. I thought that was pretty fascinating because you could stand right here all day looking forward out towards the Potomac and never know what was actually happening behind you or underneath you. And so I think we have to really pause for a second and think about the power of what we're looking at right here. Okay, these were individuals. Most of them, their names, their stories, their ages were lost to time. Yet here they are. I also want you to look at the orientation of the grave shafts. Now, if you notice, they're all pointing in the same direction. Okay, just to orient you, they're pointing east. So this would be east right here. And they're all done that way intentionally. Okay, the story behind that is that the slaves were buried with their feet pointing towards the east because that was the direction in Africa, which was the motherland. So what the thinking was is that their souls would be able to return to the motherland there. Powerful. I mean, powerful. All right, so here's another close-up. This was in 2017, so it gives you a little bit of a close-up view. The blue ones are ones that have already been excavated, but look at the green ones. These are reliable readings. These are probably additional sites. Okay, here's a close-up view of what one of those looks like. Okay, so peeling away the stories of the maps and really understanding what we're looking at and what that means for people. Okay. Another thing, this one's very interesting. So what I tried to do is find some quotes off of primary source documents that kind of went along with things we were looking at. And I found one here by Anne Pamela Cunningham. Now, if you look at the date on this one, this is 1861. It's the beginning of the Civil War. Most of us, when we think of George Washington, we think of the American Revolution. I mean, why wouldn't we? But this idea of Mount Vernon as a place is a lot more significant than just the American Revolution. Okay, so Anne Pamela Cunningham was one of the founders of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, who in the 1830s or 40s, I think, raised money to buy Mount Vernon, which was falling in disrepair, and they wanted to restore it to its former glory as kind of like this shrine to George Washington, his ideology, and to the country. So this right here is a picture that I took in the cellar of Mount Vernon, was pointed out to me by a tour guide. And they told me this great story about in the Civil War. So even though you had two opposing sides with two completely different ideologies, there were still certain things that they agreed upon. And one of those things was George Washington and the sanctity of Mount Vernon. So Civil War soldiers, when they would come close to this area in Virginia, a lot of times they would go on literally like a sightseeing tour to pay their respects and check out Mount Vernon. The problem was, is when they got there, there was a 25-cent admission that was charged. Many of them couldn't afford it, so they would have to trade things to try to get in. But also they were not allowed to wear their uniforms, and they were not allowed to bring weapons onto Mount Vernon. So the guide was telling us these stories about how you would have stacks of muskets and rifles up against a tree, and you'd have a pile of uniforms there, and you'd have Civil War soldiers visiting Mount Vernon literally in their underwear. And this right here was somebody's initials that were carved into the cellar floor of Mount Vernon during the Civil War. So it's basically like graffiti and vandalism. And I thought that that was very interesting. They didn't repair it, they left it there. So this, I don't know if this is a J or a T, obviously this is a B, but that's been there since the Civil War. Okay, we don't know if it's a Union soldier or a Confederate soldier, but it was somebody who thought enough about George Washington that they wanted to check out his place, and I guess they wanted to leave their initials behind. So here's a map of Mount Vernon at that time. You can see that it looks very different than the first one that I showed you. Okay, here's the plantation house right here on the farm, but this map is from 1861. Okay, you can see the Union picket lines. And I think this is important because, you know, you think back to some of the events that we're living in now, the storming of the Capitol not too long ago. But even at this point in history, our country was divided, but yet they could still find common ground on something. So I got to think that there's a lesson in here somewhere that can be connected to current events. I mean, George Washington, he was revered by both sides because the South, he was a Virginian, you know, and the North, he was the president. Okay. His ideology is what everybody believed in. So they could set aside their differences. And I think, like I said, I think there's a message in there now that maybe maybe we can do that too. I don't know. Seems like we're in a very similar place. All right, we're going to move on to teaching with objects. Teaching with objects is pretty interesting also because when you go into Mount Vernon, everything that you see is original, okay? Obviously, you can't go in there and touch the things and stuff like that, but it gives you a sense that you're stepping back in time. There are things in there that we see that we don't necessarily think about, but for some reason we're connected to and we're drawn to. The more we can learn about these, the more those objects can also connect us to the people of our past. So this one was one that fascinated me. So if you can see this chair right here, okay, I walked in and I looked at that and I was like, what is going on there? And so I was told that, oh, this is a fan chair. And I was like, well, what's a fan chair? So evidently back at this time in history, this was like cutting edge STEM technology. Okay, so George Washington purchased this chair while attending the Philadelphia Constitutional Convention in 1787. So if you can see down here on the bottom, there's little foot pedals on the bottom of the chair. So George could sit here and push his feet down on those foot pedals, which would move this fan back and forth over the top of his head. I thought that that was very interesting. Like I said, that was cutting edge technology in 1780. But then I also thought that, you know, there's a lesson in here also that kids have to realize that, okay, what's the weather in Philadelphia like in 1787? Okay, so Constitutional Convention, I think it was like March or April to September. Okay, the average high temperatures during that time are high 70s to high 80s. So imagine packing a bunch of people in a room, windows are open, no air conditioning, high humidity. How are they going to keep themselves cool? So that was pretty interesting. There's a lot of science and mechanical engineering that goes into this chair. Single objects are also important. Things that can be used by multiple people. They would give you multiple interpretations of how that item might be used. So right here, this is called Martha's covered cup. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit later specifically what it was used for. But if you were to show this to somebody, and this is one of the things I had the kids do, this is where the perspective comes in, okay? So you take a simple object like this. Well, how would this object have been viewed by Martha Washington herself? How might the same object have been viewed by a guest of the Washingtons while dining at Mount Vernon? Okay, the Washingtons loved to entertain. There was always people over there. But then also reminding, well, how would this be viewed by an enslaved person who was responsible for caring for this object before and after each meal? Okay, it's three completely different experiences, but it's the same common everyday object. Enameled glasses. Okay, these were lead-based enameled glasses that belonged to George Washington. So in here, you can think about the economics behind it. Okay, things like, well, how would George Washington have gotten these glasses? How much would they have cost? Where did he get the money to purchase them? And maybe what kind of drinks were served in these glasses? And then again, who served those? Okay, so you can give kids time to kind of come up with their own ideas, see how deeply they can think about this. And then you can go back and tell them, well, you know what, these were ale glasses. Oh, what's ale? Oh, it was beer. Well, why were they drinking beer? And then there's a whole nother discussion about water quality in the 1700s. So one simple object, you can get multiple perspectives, and it can lead into much bigger conversations. You know, they can go really in any direction. Here's another one, George Washington's teeth. This one's pretty interesting also. I'm going to actually play this one for you because there's some really good information that's in there that I want to talk about a little bit.
Hi, my name is Joel, and I was wondering, what were George Washington's teeth made of?
What were Washington's teeth made of? Well, everybody knows that Washington had wooden teeth, except he didn't.
Do you have enough raisin stuff?
We have one full set that survives here in the collection at Mount Vernon, and it is made from a combination of animal teeth and human teeth and some elephant ivory that has been carved into the shape of one tooth. The animal teeth are coming from probably cows and horses and have been sort of filed down to the proper shape for a human mouth. Now, the engineering of these really sort of contraptions, when you look at them, is quite amazing. The teeth are set into jaws made out of lead and held in place on both the top and the lower jaw by two sort of thin wires of metal that are curved to the shape of a jaw. Now, the bottom jaw is curved underneath to fit on George Washington's jaw, but the top denture is just flat on top. So there's nothing to hold it in place or shape it to your mouth. Then the last piece of the engineering is that at the jaws, where the two dentures come together, there are sort of very tight silver springs, so that when you open your mouth, the springs would force the upper denture to rise with your mouth. And so that's what makes the teeth go up and down as you open and close your mouth. Now, the trade-off is that because that spring is so strong, it's always pushing against the top of your mouth. So in order to keep your mouth closed, you have to really grit your teeth all the time. And I think when we look at George Washington's portraits, we can kind of imagine him doing that and really see how uncomfortable this must have been.
I love that video because it helps us kind of separate the fact from the fiction. You know, aside from him chopping down the cherry tree, which is also a myth. You know, people thought that his dentures were made of wood. It's not true. But I think this also answers a lot of questions. Well, why does he always have this look on his face in his picture? Well, okay, now we can kind of better understand that he's trying to keep his dentures closed together. But as I was watching this, I was thinking, you know, initially about the technology, the 18th century technology that's involved. But I got kind of hung up on this idea of lead because I didn't realize until the first time I watched this video that those were set in lead. So now we have to think about, okay, now in 2021, what do we know about the health risks of lead, and how did that affect George Washington over, the duration of his life? Did he have any health issues from it? Because to me, having a mouthful of lead seems like it would be inherently dangerous, but apparently it was fairly common for dentures. So then, the kids would probably ask the question, well, why do people think that they were made out of wood? And it was because they were stained from the port wine that was frequently drank. But then they also asked the question about, well, wait a minute, did they say human teeth also? Yeah, they did say human teeth. Well, where do those come from? Oh, well, we're going to get to that in just a second, because there's an interesting story behind that one also. So sometimes it's giving them just enough information to get them excited about it. And then we're like, well, we're going to come back to that in a little bit, and just let them think about it and see what they can come up with on their own. Another one of the methodologies is teaching with documents. This one's pretty important. This one's great though, because George Washington kept a lot of personal letters, a lot of reports, and he was very meticulous on everything that he kept. So those things that have managed to survive the test of time have provided like an invaluable amount of information about George Washington and his life. So this one right here is actually his ledger. He was a meticulous business person, kept track of everything. So this ledger right here is from May 8th of 1784, where he pays £6 and 2 shillings for Negroes for 9 teeth on the account of Dr. Lemoyne. So Dr. Lemoyne was his dentist. They actually met during the French and Indian War. £6, 2 shillings for 9 teeth from Negroes. So we have to assume at this point that the enslaved people were selling their teeth to George Washington. Okay. Now we don't know if those teeth were used for George's dentures or if they were used for somebody else's. But either way, I think that tells a powerful story also, and you get kids that'll say, well, yeah, but they got paid for it. But then you have other kids that'll be like, well, yeah, but do you think that they really had a choice? Probably not. But I think that that's a very interesting part of that story as well. And we only know this because of the records that were left behind. And it's literally spelled out in Washington's ledger. So there's all these little random interesting pieces of information. George Washington, he also kept a list of all the enslaved people that were at Mount Vernon. This helps kind of solidify that he's a meticulous businessman, but also that he's a slave owner. So if you click on this document, this is a transcripted document, 1799, this was the year that Washington died. And here you have, right at the top, look what it says, belonging to. Okay, so here you have this idea that we know Washington had slaves. We know he treated them like property. Okay, they were personal possessions to him. So here they are belonging to George Washington in his own right, which means they were purchased by George, but then also by marriage. So we know that when George Washington got married, his wife Martha had a dower where she had many dozens of slaves as well. So they're literally separated out by who owns who. But as you look through these, I want you to think about the stories behind some of these people. This is all we really know, okay? We have some of their names, some of their ages, remarks that are made by some of them, okay? These were all, like I said, this is a transcripted copy of George's notes. But down here, there's the total, okay? So these are ones that are tradesmen. Down here, you have labor in the mansion house. You have on the next page, children. And the children, their remarks are, who do they belong to? Okay, well, these 4 are sons and daughters of Alice, who was another slave there. So when you think about that, I like to show this to my students because I tell them, look at the ages of these children. Okay, they're the same age as some of you. And here they are, born into slavery already. What is their life like compared to what yours is like? And it's just fascinating. Look at this one right here, William Shoe MR. So this stands for shoemaker, okay? William was a shoemaker. You might know where this is going. And the remarks are that he's lame, which is a nice way of saying that he was crippled or disabled, and that he has no wife. We're going to come back to William here in a little bit also. But I want you to notice how as we use some of these documents and we use some of these objects and some of the pictures we're going to get into, they start to connect the dots and they really start to tell a story all their own. So right here, there's another set of ledgers. This is Washington's records about agricultural experiments. You know, we know he was a farmer. We know he was a successful farmer. He was always trying new things with fertilizer, crop rotation, invasive species, non-native species. He was very into the agricultural lifestyle, which would be common since he was a Virginian. Here's another document. This one's pretty interesting also. So this is a love letter from George to Martha. So I won't play this one for you just because I'm kind of watching the clock on the bottom here. But this is a great one to show the kids too. It's like a minute and a half long. And they talk about there's like this one love letter that survived history. Well, it was very common at this point that after a husband died, the wife that was widowed would burn all of the documents, all the correspondence. And that's what Martha did after George died. But this letter was found in the bottom of a desk that Martha owned that she had passed on to another family member. And somehow along the line, nobody found it until somebody actually did. And they're like, well, wait a minute, this looks like it's a love letter. And it literally was correspondence from George to Martha. 1775, right in the middle of the American Revolution. I think that it was from Philadelphia, you know, and he uses words like, I retain an unalterable affection for you, which neither time or distance can change. And that in itself is good because sometimes you look at the language that was used and the kids don't really understand what it means. And you can spend time in saying, well, okay, this is what it really means in like our common language. But the kids were always interested, you know, they thought it was kind of funny that he was writing love letters. So I just, you know, as a quick assignment, I said, all right, so we watched this video. Here's a link with a timeline about George and Martha's relationship. And you can see that it spans decades. Now, just to kind of see, you know, if George had the opportunity to write one more love letter to Martha, what do you think he would say? And then I made them write the letter and then they had to take a screenshot and post it in Google Classroom. You know, so the boys got a little freaked out about this at first because, you know, some of them, you know, they're 11 and 12. Some of them kind of like the idea of a girlfriend and some of them are still appalled by it. But once they got going, everybody came up with something. And this is just one. He says, Dear Martha, we did it. It's over. We won the war. We become our own country. The people are asking me to lead. Do I lead them? I thought that was pretty profound for an 11-year-old. Is it the right thing to do to listen to them? I want to know your opinion on this. With love, George. The reason why I picked this one is because of that last line. I want to know your opinion on this, okay? Martha was George's confidant. They had a strong relationship. I like to think that the First Lady had something to do with the decisions that George made as a president, okay? So I thought that was pretty good. Teaching with images, okay? Images could be anything from artwork at the time, prints of things that were left behind. Sometimes they can be maps, okay, but they're meant to get us thinking about things. So this was a portrait that was done of the Washington family in the 1780s. It was called literally the Washington family. So this kind of falls into that portraiture, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with and have probably used in your classrooms at one point or the other. You know, having students really study the picture, you know, asking them those questions that force them to think critically about what they're seeing, you know, what's going on in this picture. What do you see that makes you say that? What more can you find? You know, and there's endless amounts of strategies you can do with these also. You can show them, you know, you can cut it up into puzzle pieces, have them reassemble the picture. You can show them maybe only half the picture at one time, have them generate some ideas and then show them the other half and see how their thinking changes. But I think this one is interesting for a couple reasons, and kids have pointed this out also. So here's Martha. They said she looks like the queen. And she kind of does have this regal or this royal appearance to her. Same thing with George. So that kind of, you know, portrays this idea that this is American royalty. But also right here in the background, okay, you can see what appears to be an enslaved person, well-dressed, okay, probably someone of prominence within the mansion staff, but you can't really see his face. It just kind of blends into the background. I want you to think about this also. It kind of connects with William the Shoemaker idea as well. Okay. And notice what they're looking at. Here's a map. So we're learning, well, what is the map about? Is it a Mount Vernon map? And they're looking at all the real estate. Is this during the war? You don't know, but it gets some conversations generated off of it. Lots and lots of maps. Maps are very powerful because it can help you understand a point in time when you weren't there. So when you look at this back one, and like I said, all these are linked, so you can click on them and get the pop outs and stuff like that if you want. But this one in the back is a, excuse me, a map of Washington during the French and the Indian War. And down here is a little pop out of the Battle of Monongahela. And so Monongahela here is an actual map from that point in history. So I think it's interesting to see, well, how does this compare to this one? And then remember that staircase I was talking about earlier? Well, here it is again. So you start to look at these and go, okay, well, what does the staircase have to do with the French and the Indian War? So we had this idea that George Washington, because he was a surveyor, he knew things of value, okay? He was an upper class citizen, really, if you think about it. During the French and Indian War, he came across some black walnut and he thought this black walnut would look very nice as a staircase in my house. So he procured it, okay? We don't know if it was on the ground or if it was chopped down, but somehow during this war, he comes across this black walnut. They return it safely to Mount Vernon and it's turned into this handrail right here. So when you walk in there, this is very highly polished. It's the original handrail from the French and the Indian War. So remember when I told you about standing there looking at the front door, waiting for somebody to knock on the door and like how powerful that is? As you walk upstairs in Mount Vernon and you take your hand and you put it on the stairwell and you're running your hand up the stairwell as you're going upstairs, it's like electrifying because you are literally in the same time in the same space as George Washington. And you start thinking of how many times did he walk up these stairs? How many times did he run his hand along this handrail? And it's just a very powerful experience. But here you're taking a couple of things that are seemingly unrelated and all of a sudden you're connecting the dots and you get a bigger picture of what's really happening at this time and place. Music is a challenging one for me because I'm not very musically inclined. I haven't done anything with this methodology in my classroom. But what I can tell you is that George Washington was a big fan of music. And when you look at some of the traditional lyrics and composers from this time, you can almost treat them like a text. Like an 18th century text, and think about what are the lyrics really telling us? What's the message behind the music? There's talk about slave songs in the field. We don't really have much of a record from that time in history at Mount Vernon, but what we do know from slave songs in the field is a lot of them come a little bit later in history, so we don't know how those compare to these. And then this one right here, drum and fife, you could have some fun with this in the classroom playing it in the background, but like I said, I haven't really done much with this. It's not really in my skill set, and I'm sure that you guys could probably come up with some great ways to use it in yours. Food, this is a fun one. Okay, food was a huge part of Mount Vernon in everyday life. You have to think about it. There was 300 plus enslaved people living on that plantation, plus Washington's family, plus the guests. There was a tremendous amount of people that needed to be fed. Okay, so one of the focuses of the plantation was producing food to feed these people and to make a profit. So one of the things that was very successful and very profitable at Mount Vernon was fish. Okay, being right on the Potomac, there was an endless amount of fish for about 6 to 8 weeks out of the year. So in that 6 to 8 weeks out of the year, fishing was literally happening round the clock, okay? And the fish was being salted or smoked so that it could be used later on in the season. It was used to feed, supplement the food of the enslaved people. It was fed on the Washington's table, and then the excess was taken and loaded on ships and sent down to the West Indies, where it was sold on plantations down there. It was tremendously profitable for George Washington, and he made significantly more money off of fishing than he did off of agriculture. This one was a fun one to do around Valentine's Day. They talk about teaching with food, specifically chocolate. The kids like this one because all kids like chocolate. But you see this cup right here? Remember when we looked at that one earlier? This cup comes into play now in this video. So this video is a little bit longer. It's like 15 minutes, but it's very informative because it talks a little bit about the trade, how you go from cocoa to chocolate, how does it end up in Virginia, how is it served today versus how it was served back in Washington's time. But what I did is I took that video and I combined it with some information on the website. And then I gave them this worksheet, where it talks about this cup. So this was a remember, this is Martha's covered cup. So it was a two-handled covered cup, and these were used in Europe primarily for serving chocolate or a warm spiced ale or wine. So these were given to Martha as a gift. They were used frequently at Mount Vernon, okay? This idea of hot chocolate was kind of like an exotic drink at this point in history. So now you can kind of circle back and go, okay, now that we know what this is for, how might it have been viewed by Martha Washington and a guest or an enslaved person? So I took this was one of my students filled this one out. You know, he said Martha was known for liking chocolate and most of the time ate it in a drink, which was true, but I think he meant she would drink it in a drink. And she would probably react positively to it, as would the guest. But the enslaved person might look at it differently and say, you know what, chocolate takes a lot of work to make. And they would know now that they had a lot of work to do to prepare it, to serve it, to clean up from it. So that kind of helps kids with that perspective thing. Okay. All right, and biography. I think this is the last one, and we're going to have to go through this one really quickly. But biography is interesting because there's an endless amount of biographies written about George Washington. So we know a tremendous amount of him. But I always like the other side of the story. So if we had more time, I would spend a lot more time talking about William Lee. So remember Will, the shoemaker? Okay, so this was William Lee. He was a personal valet to George Washington, basically like his manservant at this point in history. So the interesting about William Lee, though, is that for 2 decades, he served George Washington side by side. Literally just about anywhere George was, William was there with him. So this spans from the 1860s, right after the French and Indian War, all the way through the American Revolution, all the way up to George Washington's death. Whatever George saw, William was there. So I always think about that perspective about, okay, if we could give William a voice, what would he have to say about everything that he saw? There's a short little reenactment here, and they tell you more about William that I think is very interesting. We're pressed for time. I'm going to skip it, but if you have to come back and watch any video in here, please pick this one. So right up until the point of Washington's death, William is there. Okay, William was a trusted person by George Washington. Okay, so you think of George Washington sitting in Valley Forge. William was there, okay, having these meetings at the table with all of his generals and what are the decisions that we're going to make for the American Revolution. William is there. Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. William is there. So they had this bond, and I think at some point this bond surpassed master and slave, and there was almost a friendship that developed. William would be considered he would have a role of prominence within the enslaved community. Okay, he was tall, athletic, just like George Washington. He was an expert horseman, just like George Washington. It makes sense. Okay, but he would be, like I said, he would have a role of prominence. There was such a strong relationship with them that in George Washington's last will, which he wrote in July of 1799, he's granting immediate freedom to William upon his death. He's freeing his other slaves also, but not until after Martha dies, but not William. William gets immediate freedom. He also has the opportunity to stay on at Mount Vernon, and he's given an annuity of $30 a year. So $30 a year is a significant amount of money at this time because, you know, the typical person might make $60 a year. So for a previously enslaved person to make half that, it was kind of a big deal. And so William goes on to stay on at Mount Vernon. He becomes a cobbler, shoemaker, and he stays there because he has his status. He has his prominence at Mount Vernon. Okay, he has a nice place to live. So you think now that he's a freed Black man, what his other options would be? Mount Vernon was probably the best place for him to stay. And he lives there until he dies in like 1810. So back to the virtual tour, when we talk about biographies, just a reminder that biographies can be found in a variety of places, not just books and written sources. So when we went to that virtual tour and we talked about the staircase and we talked about the distillery and all the other things that were going on in there, that kind of fills in the blanks that are kind of left out in a lot of biographies. This is a great thing here. I wish we had time to play this simulation. They have this interactive theater. It's called Be Washington. And basically what it does is it allows you to do a single player game, or you can host a game, and it's all live action where you are put into a similar position as Washington and you're given similar amounts of information, and then you have to make choices based on that information. So like the Whiskey Rebellion is in there. I'm trying to think of what else. I haven't played it yet with my classes this year. So if I just will quick show you, say I was going to do a single player game. All right, so here's my choices. Do I want to immerse myself in the Battle of Second Trenton, the Newburgh Conspiracy, the Jennett Affair, or the Whiskey Rebellion? Okay, so whatever one I click on, it puts me there. There's live action role playing going on. It's really, really fun to play. And so the last thing as we run out of time that I'm going to leave you with are these two final pictures. Okay, so George Washington dies on December 14th of 1799. Basically, he dies because he has like a strep type infection and his throat swells up and he basically suffocates to death. But after he's checking to make sure that his affairs are in order, that Martha burns the copy of the will that he doesn't want to keep, his final words are, "'Tis well." So this portrait here was painted in the 1860s, okay, and this was the death of George Washington. So as you look back here in the corner, here's that mysterious person, okay, that's William Lee, okay, so throughout Washington's adult life, most of the time, William is there, okay, he's kind of like this background to everything that's happening in history. But I want you to take a look at, you know, the way that this is portrayed versus this is the actual bedchamber. This is the actual bed that George Washington died in. Okay, so when you kind of compare the two, you know, this is obviously not a primary source. This is. Okay, how do these compare? And I think it's interesting to note that when you look at this, Martha's over here. She's painted in grayscale. She's looking in the opposite direction. These are probably children and grandchildren looking on. Okay, one of these guys is Washington's personal physician, who Washington happened to meet during the French and Indian War at that Battle of Monongahela, right after General Braddock was killed and George Washington took over and kind of became a hero for getting the British forces out of there before they were massacred. So dots all over the place to connect. Like I said, it's a rabbit hole of information. A couple people I want to thank. Dan Hibma, he was the sponsor that paid for me to go to Mount Vernon